It was the spring of 1994, a season of fresh beginnings. When the local ballet troupe from Grand Haven prepared for what was meant to be the highlight of their young careers. 12 dancers, all between the ages of 14 and 18, along with their dedicated coach, boarded a bus bound for a regional performance in northern Michigan. Parents snapped photos, some waved with tears in their eyes, and others shouted reminders about forgotten lunchboxes and warm jackets. For most, it felt like an ordinary goodbye before a routine trip, but none of those parents could have imagined it would be the last time they would ever see their daughters. The excitement inside the bus was undeniable. The girls rehearsed, lines of choreography in their seats, humming along to the same classical tunes they had practiced for weeks. Their coach, a woman admired in the community for her discipline and grace, reminded them of posture, breathing, and precision. Everything about that evening was filled with routine familiarity, except for one subtle detail that a few parents later recalled. The bus driver seemed unusually tense, glancing nervously at the tree line as they pulled away. The plan was simple: a 2-hour drive north to a theater that had hosted countless performances before. Yet by nightfall, something went terribly wrong. Families who expected quick calls or messages confirming their safe arrival grew restless when their phones stayed silent. At first, excuses were made. Maybe the bus broke down, maybe rehearsals ran late, or maybe they'd simply forgotten to call in the excitement of the show. But as midnight passed, unease settled in. By morning, panic had taken over. The police were alerted, search teams were dispatched, and news channels began reporting on the missing troupe. Parents clung to each other at the bus terminal, whispering prayers and begging for updates. The strangest part, investigators noted, was that there had been no emergency calls, no witnesses of a breakdown, and no reports of the bus passing through nearby towns. It was as if the entire vehicle, along with every soul inside, had disappeared from the road in plain sight. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that the troupe had been kidnapped by a cult known to operate in the area. Others suggested a tragic accident, perhaps the bus plunging into a ravine or river hidden by the thick Michigan woods. But the highway was searched thoroughly: no tire marks, no wreckage, and no sign of a crash. Parents grew desperate, clinging to the last image burned into their memories: their daughters waving from the windows of the bus, faces bright with excitement, completely unaware that they were heading toward a journey from which they would never return. 2 days after the ballet troupe's disappearance, a local hunter wandering through the edge of the Manistee National Forest stumbled upon something strange. Parked neatly on a narrow dirt road was the missing bus. At first glance, it looked as though it had simply broken down, waiting for repairs. But the hunter quickly realized something was wrong. The bus doors stood wide open, and the interior looked frozen in time, as if every passenger had vanished in the middle of an ordinary ride. He wasted no time in alerting the authorities. Within hours, police cars swarmed the area, their flashing lights casting eerie glows across the towering pines. When investigators boarded the bus, the scene that greeted them was unsettling. The girls' belongings were still there: purses, jackets, ballet shoes scattered under seats, even half-finished water bottles resting in cup holders. A single violin case sat propped up against a window, untouched. It was as though the passengers had simply evaporated. But what unnerved the officers most was the lack of chaos. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned seats, no shattered glass. Every item looked perfectly normal, except for the fact that the passengers were gone. Outside the bus, the ground was inspected for clues. Investigators expected to find footprints, drag marks, or even tire impressions from another vehicle, but the soil was untouched. Not a single print led away from the bus, despite it being surrounded by soft dirt and damp earth from recent rain. Even the bus driver, who should have at least left a trace if he exited, seemed to have disappeared into thin air. It was as if the bus had been placed there deliberately, like an abandoned stage set left in the forest with no actors to fill it. Inside, detectives found one strange detail that fueled speculation. In the back row of the bus, someone had drawn a series of small figures into the condensation on the windows. 12 stick-like dancers, all holding hands in a perfect circle, with a taller figure in the middle that resembled their coach. The drawings looked almost childlike, but none of the parents recognized them as something their daughters had made before. Questions erupted: were the dancers trying to leave a message, or had someone else been there after them? The discovery made headlines across the state, turning the missing ballet troupe into a national mystery. Reporters described the scene as eerily staged, while locals whispered that the forest had always been cursed, swallowing people whole without explanation. Search teams combed the surrounding woods, but no tracks, blood, or clothing scraps surfaced. The bus stood there silently, with its seats still carrying the faint smell of hairspray and perfume, like a frozen time capsule of that night. To the families, it was proof that their daughters had made it that far. To the police, it was the beginning of a puzzle that made no sense at all. When detectives combed through the bus, they gathered every scrap of evidence, receipts, snack wrappers, and school notebooks left behind. But it was inside a leather satchel, tucked neatly beneath the coach's seat, that investigators found something chilling. A worn, black journal. The edges were frayed, the binding cracked, and its pages filled with delicate handwriting. At first glance, it seemed to be nothing more than a personal diary, filled with practice notes and reminders about choreography. But as detectives read further, the tone shifted, and an unsettling picture began to emerge. The earlier entries described the coach's pride in her students, her hopes for their performance, and her stress about the long drive. But sprinkled between rehearsal notes were strange observations, mentions of figures near the theater, and someone watching during practice. Parents had always thought the coach was overly protective, even superstitious, but her words painted a far more disturbing reality. She described sleepless nights, convinced that the troupe was being followed for weeks leading up to their disappearance. One entry in particular left investigators speechless. Written just days before the trip, it read, "The girls laugh when I tell them, but I know I'm not imagining it. At rehearsals, I see shadows in the far corner, never moving, always watching. Last night, I dreamed of the forest, not empty, but alive with eyes. If anything happens on the road, they must look here first." The words "they must look here" were underlined 3 times, almost tearing through the page. No one could explain who they were, but the coach seemed utterly convinced that someone, or something, was closing in. The final entry in the journal, dated the very night of the disappearance, was the most unnerving of all. The handwriting grew jagged, as if rushed. "They're watching us. I see them in the trees as we drive. The girls don't believe me, but I feel it. If we don't make it to the theater, someone will know why." After that, the pages went blank. No follow-up, no closure, just silence. Investigators held the journal up as evidence, but to the parents, it was like reading a farewell letter written in real time. When this revelation became public, panic spread. Was the coach paranoid, slowly unraveling under pressure? Or had she truly seen something no one else had noticed? Some speculated that the journal hinted at a stalker, perhaps someone obsessed with the dancers. Others whispered darker theories, that the coach had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to, and the troupe paid the price. Whatever the case, the journal gave the first terrifying hint that the disappearance was not an accident. It had been anticipated. As the years passed, the disappearance of the ballet troupe faded from national headlines. New tragedies emerged, fresh mysteries gripped the public's attention, and eventually, the world seemed to move on. Families of the missing dancers were left to grieve in silence. Some relocated to escape the constant reminders. Others tried to rebuild their lives, and a few chose to believe their daughters had perished, laying empty coffins to rest in quiet cemeteries. But not every parent surrendered to the passage of time. Among them was Richard Allen, a quiet working-class father, who refused to let the memory of his daughter vanish, along with the rest of the troupe. Richard had been a mechanic all his life, a man of grease-stained hands and few words. Neighbors often described him as stubborn, even obsessive, but those who knew him well understood why. His daughter, Lily, had been only 15 when she disappeared. She was the light of his life, the one who danced in the family garage after long rehearsals, twirling between toolboxes and broken engines. While others found ways to cope, Richard never stopped searching. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, he returned to the very spot where the bus had been found, leaving behind a bouquet of fresh flowers and a photo of Lily smiling, in her ballet costume. The police had long since closed the case as unresolved, but Richard treated it as unfinished business. He collected newspaper clippings, pieced together rumors, and even spoke with hunters and hikers who swore they had heard strange music echoing through the woods at night. His home gradually transformed into a shrine of unanswered questions, maps with pins and strings, boxes of photocopied reports, and a shelf filled with candles that he lit every evening in his daughter's memory. To outsiders, it looked like obsession. To Richard, it was duty. He believed the forest still held answers, waiting to be uncovered. Over the decades, he became somewhat of a local legend, the father who never gave up. Teenagers whispered about him during campfire stories, calling him the ghost hunter of Manistee, while townsfolk pitied his inability to let go. But Richard didn't care. To him, the whispers, the pity, even the ridicule, meant nothing compared to the faint hope that his daughter might still be out there. That hope, fragile but unbroken, was the only reason he woke up each morning. And so, 31 years after the disappearance, Richard returned once more to the forest. The air was heavy with silence, the same silence that had haunted him since the night Lily vanished. But this time was different. Instead of flowers and a photo, he carried a metal detector, determined to dig deeper into the soil that had concealed the troop's fate for so long. As he wandered into the thick of the woods, the device began to beep faintly, a sound that would lead him to a discovery far darker than anything he had ever prepared for. The metal detector gave a shrill, steady tone as Richard swept it across the moss-covered ground near an abandoned cabin deep in the Manistee woods. At first, he assumed it was nothing more than a buried tin can or a rusted nail, the kind of junk hunters left behind decades ago. But when the tone grew sharper and more insistent, his heart began to pound. Kneeling down, he dug into the earth with trembling hands, scraping through dirt and tangled roots until his fingers struck something solid. Carefully, he unearthed a small, rusted music box, its once golden paint dulled by years of decay. Richard brushed away the mud and turned the delicate key on its side. To his shock, the music box still worked. A soft, haunting lullaby spilled into the forest air, each note echoing against the trees like a ghostly echo from the past. It was a melody he recognized instantly. Lily had danced to it countless times, twirling barefoot in the garage, begging him to watch her routines after work. The sound hit him like a knife to the chest. It wasn't just any tune, it was her tune. But what froze him in place wasn't the song. It was the message scratched crudely into the underside of the lid. In jagged, uneven letters, barely legible, were 3 words: "We are here." Richard stared at the inscription, his breath catching in his throat. The letters didn't look machine-stamped. They looked carved by hand, desperate and frantic, as though someone had used a nail or a piece of stone to etch them in. His mind raced. Was it a cruel prank, or had Lily or one of the other girls left this behind as a plea for help? Richard staggered back, his legs weak, the lullaby still playing its eerie tune. Questions swirled violently in his head. How could the box have survived 3 decades buried beneath the soil? Why had it been left here, so far from where the bus was found? And who had written that message? He wanted to believe it was his daughter's hand, that she had found a way to leave proof of life, even after all these years. But another thought slithered into his mind, one he could barely bring himself to face. What if "we are here" didn't mean they were alive, but that they never left? He clutched the box tightly and stumbled toward the cabin, looming just beyond the trees. Its rotting wood creaked in the wind, windows shattered long ago, and the smell of mildew lingered. Around its base, Richard had walked past this place 100 times over the years, always dismissing it as just another ruin swallowed by the forest. But tonight, with the music box humming in his hands and the carved message burning into his mind, the cabin no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like a doorway, and for the first time in 3 decades, Richard sensed he was standing at the edge of an answer he had been chasing his entire life. The cabin loomed like a skeleton in the clearing, its roof sagging inward, walls rotting with age, and vines twisting their way through cracks in the wood. Richard hesitated at the threshold, gripping the music box so tightly his knuckles turned white. The door groaned as he pushed it open, the hinges shrieking in protest, releasing a wave of damp, stale air that smelled of mold and earth. For years, locals had dismissed the cabin as nothing more than a hunter's shack left to decay, but Richard's instincts screamed otherwise. Something about the silence inside felt heavy, as if the building itself were holding its breath. He stepped cautiously into the main room, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The floor was warped and uneven, covered in dust and the remnants of broken furniture. But as he swept the light across the boards, something caught his attention, a faint outline of a square hatch near the fireplace, just barely visible beneath the dirt. Dropping to his knees, he brushed it clean, his heart hammering as he realized it was a trapdoor. Rusted hinges jutted out from its frame, and the wood bore faint scratches, as though someone had clawed at it desperately, trying to get out. Richard's hands shook as he pried it open. The hinges screeched, the sound echoing through the cabin like a scream. A wave of cold, Stale air rose from the darkness below, carrying with it a smell that made his stomach turn, the scent of damp stone, mildew, and something far older. He aimed his flashlight into the opening, and the beam revealed a narrow staircase, descending into the earth. The steps were carved from stone, slick with moisture, and descending into pitch-black shadows. Every instinct told him to leave, but every memory of Lily pushed him forward. At the bottom of the staircase, Richard entered a hidden chamber. His light flickered across the walls, and his breath caught in his throat. Tattered ballet costumes were strewn across the floor, their once bright fabrics dulled and moth-scuffed ballet shoes sat in corners, some small enough to belong to the youngest of the girls. On the stone walls were scratches, long, frantic claw marks gouged into the surface. Some faint, others deep enough to splinter the rock. The chamber was silent now, but it bore the unmistakable evidence of suffering. This had been no ordinary hideout. It was a prison. Just as Richard began to absorb the horror, he noticed something far more disturbing. Along the dusty floor, in a layer of grime that should have been undisturbed for decades, were footprints, fresh ones, small and delicate, like those of a dancer's foot, pressed clearly into the dust. They trailed away from the corner of the chamber and lead back up the stairs toward the surface, not into the cabin, but out into the forest. Richard froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. Someone, or something, had been there recently, and whatever it was, it hadn't left alone. After Richard reported his discovery, investigators returned to the cabin with advanced equipment. Motion sensors, cameras, and night vision lenses were installed around the clearing and the hidden chamber, their red lights blinking in the dark like silent sentinels. The official story was that they were monitoring for animal activity, but everyone involved knew the truth. They were waiting for something else. For decades, people had whispered about music drifting through the woods at night, about ghostly figures seen between the trees. Now, for the first time, there was a chance to capture proof. Days passed with nothing but silence. The equipment recording endless footage of swaying branches and restless deer. But on the fourth night, just after midnight, the motion sensors triggered. Cameras whirred to life, their lenses turning toward the forest edge. At first, the figures were blurry, flickering between shadows, but as they drew nearer, the images grew clearer. They moved gracefully, almost unnaturally, their limbs bending and twisting in perfect unison, as if rehearsing a performance no one had ever seen before. They weren't walking, they were dancing. The footage revealed pale figures in tattered ballet costumes, their skirts torn, their shoes worn thin, yet their posture was flawless. They glided silently across the clearing, their faces expressionless, eyes reflecting the faint glow of the cameras. Richard watched the recording in silence, his chest tightening as his gaze locked on one particular figure near the center. She had the same delicate movements, the same tilt of her head that Lily had always carried when she danced. He whispered her name under his breath, convinced it was her, his daughter. Unchanged, untouched by time, yet undeniably not the same girl he had once known. The strangest detail wasn't their appearance, but their behavior. They didn't stumble, didn't tire, didn't break formation. Their movements were precise, mechanical, almost ritualistic, as though they were bound to some eternal choreography. At one point, the tallest figure in the group, likely the coach, raised her arm, and the rest followed in flawless synchronization. It wasn't a dance of joy or beauty anymore. It was a performance of control, something rehearsed endlessly in the dark woods for an audience that had never been meant to see. The footage ended abruptly when one of the figures turned its head directly toward the hidden camera. The face was pale, eyes hollow, but there was an uncanny awareness in its stare. For a brief moment, the camera lens flickered with static, and when the image returned, the clearing was empty. No footprints, no figures, no sign they had ever been there. Investigators tried to dismiss it as a glitch, but Richard knew better. He swore on everything he had left that he had seen his daughter among them. She wasn't gone. She was still dancing, trapped in a performance that had never ended. And so, 31 years after their disappearance, the mystery of the vanished ballet troupe remains unsolved. A bus abandoned without footprints, a coach's journal warning, of shadowy watchers, a music box whispering "We are here," and pale dancers caught on camera in the dead of night. Each piece fits together. Yet the puzzle refuses to form a clear picture. Were they taken by someone? Consumed by something older than the forest itself? Or have they become part of the woods, forever dancing in the silence between the trees? Richard Allen still believes his daughter is out there, waiting, moving to a rhythm no one else can hear. The authorities may call it folklore. The townspeople may dismiss it as legend, but those who have seen the footage whisper a chilling truth. The dancers never left. Their performance goes on, night after night, hidden from the world, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to watch until the very end. So the next time you hear music drifting through the forest with no source in sight, listen closely, because it may not be the wind. It may be them. And once you see them dance, you may never leave the woods the same again.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.